Mark Rogers TV and Inside the ACC, breaking down a huge week one in the ACC, taking on the SEC. So these are matchups that we typically wait until the final weekend of the season when the Eastern Division in the SEC takes on the likes of Louisville and Florida State and Georgia Tech. But here in week one, we've got three what could be tremendous matchups. Mike McDaniel from, of course, Inside the ACC helping us break it down. So, Mike, let's start with a very intriguing game pitting Georgia against North Carolina. Georgia coming off a 10-3 campaign. Carolina at 11-3, of course, Coastal Division champions. Your thoughts about how this one could swing?
So initially, when looking at Georgia, you have a new quarterback, right, in Jacob Eason. You have a new coach in Kirby Smart. And then you flip to the other side and you look at North Carolina offensively, and they got a new quarterback, Mitch Trubisky, but they got all the weapons on their offensive side of the football that, led to them being a top 10 unit in the country last season. It's going to be really interesting. It's going to be a battle of which defense gets themselves on track first. I think when looking at North Carolina the last couple of seasons, what we've seen out of Gene Chizik's unit there as defensive coordinator is that North Carolina, when he came in 2 seasons ago, was one of the worst defenses in college football. So he comes in last year, has a great season, kind of gets him completely turned around, and North Carolina goes from really bad to mediocre on defense. And all of a sudden, now you're looking for the Tar Heels to make the next step on that side of the football. And if they do that, they're going to be an extremely formidable team, assuming their offense plays as well as everybody's expecting them to. When looking at Georgia, all the questions on offense, if they get good quarterback play, then they should be in solid shape. They do have the two-head monster at running back, Mark, with Chubb and Sonny Michel. They do have injury issues, but on that side of the football, assuming everybody's healthy and Jacob Eason plays well as a freshman, their offense should be pretty good, and Georgia should compete in that SEC. I think when looking at the defense, of course, Mark, when talking about Kirby Smart and how tough he went after the front seven there coming out of spring, and he really wasn't happy with that defense, that front seven. They've lost a lot of guys on that side of the football. They were number 7 in the country in total defense last year, so it's going to be a situation in this game coming up this weekend where if North Carolina gets shut down on offense against a very good Georgia defense, what are they going to do? Because, when looking at North Carolina's defense, they've struggled over the last couple of seasons. Are they going to take the next step this year? Well, game one's going to be a really big test for them. I think with North Carolina's defense, if they're able to slow down Georgia just enough and put enough points on the board, North Carolina should win the football game. But there are just so many unknowns on both sides right now that while both teams are ranked in the top 25, I think there are more questions than answers heading into this matchup.
Intriguing situation when you take one of the top coordinators in college football over a long span of time and make him a head coach, because it's a completely different position and different situation. You go from X's and O's to CEO. So Kirby Smart, we saw a situation actually last night in the very first college football game of the season, Hawaii Cal, where Nick Rolovich took over the Hawaii program, and he makes a statement by coming up with an onside kick to start the game. So who knows what Kirby Smart is going to do in game one as a head coach on the sideline. He has made the bold move of inserting Jacob Eason as the starting quarterback based on everything we've heard. And you allude to that situation there. Grayson Lambert, ACC fans very familiar with him and his stint at Virginia, threw 12 touchdowns against 2 picks. Good stats on the surface last year, but didn't play well in the big games for Georgia when they needed him. Bryce Ramsey, actually the third-string quarterback, has the best arm, but Jacob Eason's the kid with the ceiling, and they didn't play it safe and go with the veteran in Lambert. They go with the kid in Eason, who should be supported by the great running game, but Nick Chubb left against Tennessee last year. We haven't seen him since. One of the very best backs in college football, and if he can come back healthy, he's probably right there with Fournette and Cook and McCaffrey. 8.1 yards per carry in 2015 after a huge 14 season. Sonny Michel right there with him with over 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns last year. So it's going to be something for the North Carolina defense to have to toughen up against an SEC team. And that's one of the dynamics that we see sometimes ACC, SEC, is the SEC just a little bit too strong in the trenches.
Yeah, and the thing about North Carolina in this game, you talk about being strong in the trenches. That's something they really struggled with last season. It was one of the more pressing reasons why their defense wasn't as good as it could have been, even though they did make great improvement. The front seven really struggled. And I think defensively, that's where they could have an issue in this football game. Whoever's running the football for Georgia is going to put pressure on that North Carolina front seven. And I think that's going to be one of the big differences in this game, or one of the keys to the game, if you will. I just think pitting North Carolina's front seven up against the offensive line of Georgia, I mean, I think that's going to make a huge difference in who wins the football game, just because we've seen so many times last season where North Carolina put up more than enough points to win, but maybe, take, for example, the ACC championship against Clemson. Ultimately, Clemson just beat them down, and defensively, North Carolina couldn't handle it. So I like the Tar Heels offensively. They got Bug Howard, they got Ryan Switzer out on the outside playing receiver, a really good running back in Elijah Hood. And I think in this opening weekend, you might not get two sets of running backs as good as you're getting with North Carolina's Elijah Hood and TJ Logan. And then, of course, Georgia with Sonny Michel and Nick Chubb. I mean, these are four running backs that if they all end up playing, it's one of the more intriguing matchups on either side on opening weekend. But, the difference in this game is going to be how North Carolina's front seven on defense deals with that offensive line that's big in the trenches and really powers that Georgia rushing attack. Because, look, in week one, you're trying to see what you have as a unit. And I think everybody knows that North Carolina's offense with Mitch Trubisky and what he's done in spot duty for Marquee Williams over the last few seasons. We know that Trubisky's pretty talented. North Carolina's offense should be pretty good. But I think one of the questions that we have heading into the ACC season, especially when considering who's going to compete for the Coastal and kind of challenge either Clemson or Florida State out of the Atlantic, is can North Carolina emerge as a team for a second year in a row, and can their defense be good enough to go out there and not only win the Coastal but then compete and try to win an ACC championship?
Greg Pike is actually one of the very best up front for Georgia along the offensive line. He's on all the trophy award lists preseason. Malcolm Mitchell, their best wide receiver, deep threat, gone from last season. A lot of unproven guys in that Georgia wide receiver core. Terry Godwin, probably the guy to look out for as a freshman, caught 35 passes. Reggie Davis, 71-yard punt return for a touchdown in a pivotal win against Tennessee last year. He could factor into this game. The one matchup before we move on this one, Mike, that I really like is all that speed and talent and ability at North Carolina at wide receiver. Ryan Switzer, Mac Hollins, Bug Howard, as you mentioned, against a Georgia secondary that only gave up 156 yards passing per game. You alluded to the overall rank defensively. They were number one against the pass, and they have two of the very best safeties in college football, and Dominique Sanders and Quincy Mauger. So Georgia loaded in the secondary, North Carolina at wide receiver. It's always fun to watch the freakish athletes go at each other, wide receivers and DBs there. Very interesting. Georgia, North Carolina, that's the 5:30 Eastern time game from the Georgia Dome on Saturday. Later that night, possibly a situation on the Plains where Clemson may overwhelm Auburn. The Tigers come in at 7-6. The Clemson Tigers, of course, going all the way to the national championship game at 14-1. Mike, Deshaun Watson, after almost winning the Heisman Trophy last year, gets his first primetime performance to stake his claim.
Yeah, so what's going to be interesting in this game, it's flying under the radar a little bit here with Clemson and Auburn. Obviously, the offenses are very good, right? So you have Clemson's offense, one of the top in college football last year. It's not really much of an argument that Deshaun Watson at least enters the season as probably the best quarterback in the country. He's definitely the best quarterback in the ACC. And entering the game this weekend against a pretty solid Auburn team. I mean, I know they've struggled the last couple seasons, but this is a team, Mark, that entering the preseason, usually the last few seasons, has had extremely high expectations for them, despite not having a quarterback that can really produce within their offense. And they think they found that this year with Shaun White. And for Gus Malzahn, it's an interesting situation because he brought Auburn to a national championship. It's been a roller coaster ride ever since. Obviously, they've struggled through SEC play each of the last two seasons, but they have an offense that, when run properly and when running as effectively as we've seen it in the past, is pretty impossible to stop. They have so many different elements to it. With that option, they run out of the shotgun there. It's kind of a triple option attack out of the gun. They've kind of revolutionized almost the Georgia Tech offense. It's pretty impressive what they do there at Auburn, and we know how much pressure they can put on defense when they're running it well. So it'll be interesting to see if Shaun White, despite his lack of running ability necessarily, if he's able to still bring the same elements to the table running the football as he is throwing the football, where he's probably the most effective passer on the Auburn team. With Clemson, they're losing a couple guys up front, off of last year's team, and Shaq Lawson and Kevin Dodd. And that can't really be understated. I mean, those were two of the better players in the front seven there for Clemson. We expect the Tigers to be very good, especially with the guys they've brought in recruiting-wise. heading into the season. They have a good young group, a bunch of 4 and 5 stars, obviously littering the defense as replacements for those 2 guys I just alluded to. But Clemson, with the way they've struggled in the past, well, the way they've appeared to struggle in the past, they generally come back, and on defense they're able to bounce right back. When you think they're down, they come right back at you. And I think with Clemson's unit, especially with the secondary, the veteran leadership they have in the secondary, even though they're losing a guy like Mackenzie Alexander, I really like the Tigers' defense this year more than a lot of people do, even though they're so young. I mean, they were young last season and didn't really stop them. So one of the elements to watching this game is how Auburn's going to be able to cope with a young Clemson defense. Is Clemson's young defense ready for the challenge that Auburn can put on you with that option attack? That's one of the things we're going to have to watch in this game, outside, of course, of Deshaun Watson, who has the ability to take over the game. So if Auburn's able to keep Deshaun Watson in front of them, I think they have a good chance in this game, and a better chance than most people think, especially since they're playing at home.
This is what most people would consider to be a make or break season for Gus Malzahn. So you allude to the roller coaster ride. It's one of the more strange plights in college football in recent memory. A team that's a perennial top 15 program catapulting to 0-8 in the SEC in 2012. Gene Chizik fired, and we talked about him going to North Carolina eventually. Gus Malzahn comes in, leads them to the national championship team. From 0-8 to the BCS championship game is unprecedented, but they've taken a bit of a free fall and stepped back to 8 wins, then 7 wins last season. This was the #1 rushing attack in the SEC Malzahn's first 2 seasons. Last year, they were in the middle of the pack in the SEC in rushing, but if you really grind it down in terms of effectiveness, 10th in the league in yards per carry. So they've lost their swagger in the rushing attack. Gus Malzahn talked during SEC Media Days about being less CEO, getting his first huge coaching job. He thought he had to be strictly CEO, and that he's a football coach. He needs to be more into the specifics and details of the offense to get it back to where it was. So he's going to do more coaching. It's going to be interesting, based on your analysis, Mike, that they choose a pocket passer and Sean White to be the starting quarterback. So he obviously just flat out won the job over the Florida State transfer, Jonathan Franklin, and the guy that we were hyping, or a lot of people were at this time last year for the Heisman Trophy, Jeremy Johnson, who fizzled and busted and lost his job. Sean White's a pocket passer. He throws it downfield. They've got a pace and a triple option attack out of the no huddle that is what Malzahn knows how to coach and what they do best. So I'm going to be interested in terms of the play calling and the strategy. And they lost Rock Thomas to Jacksonville State. He's a transfer at running back. Peyton Barber left early to the NFL. So ACC fans, look out for Jovan Robinson. He's a dynamic back, but they don't have much depth for Auburn at running back. So that's the situation offensively for Auburn that's going to be very intriguing. Defensively, they have Sam Cowart, who was the #1 recruited player out of high school 2 years ago along the defensive line. Malzahn alluded to this a couple practices ago, that Carl Lawson, one of the best defensive ends in college football, just makes that defense completely different when he's on the field, but that's been the problem. He hasn't been able to stay on the field, so he's making his comeback. They're very solid at D-tackle with Dontavius Russell and Montravis Adams. So against Wayne Gallman, the strong defensive line for Auburn against the running attack, that's going to be key as well.
Yeah, and what I'm looking for in this game is whatever team's able to establish the run better than the other, I think is going to have a vast advantage in this football game. Deshaun Watson, he can throw the football all day on you. He's a guy that can hurt you more with his arm than he can with his legs, even though he's a very dynamic runner. But if they're able to establish a run with Deshaun Watson and Wayne Gallman more easily than Auburn's able to, with the bevy of running backs that they have, all young and unproven at this point, and what's the play calling going to be like with Sean White as a pocket passer, like we've talked about here? That's going to be interesting as well. How is Gus Malzahn going to call his plays, kind of tailoring to the fact that, hey, we have this offense that we've run quite effectively here over the past 5 or 6 years, but how am I going to do this now with a quarterback who is not a system quarterback? He's more of a pocket passer. He doesn't really fit into what we're trying to do, but he's a guy who brings the veteran leadership, who's a very good passer from the pocket. Are we going to throw the football more? that's going to be something to watch as well. But Clemson's got the advantage here. I mean, look, they're the number 2 team in the country for a reason. Best quarterback on the planet right now in college football. I really enjoy watching Deshaun Watson play. Wayne Gallman, I think, could play a huge role in this one, but it's all going to come down to whether or not the defensive front of Auburn can hang with Clemson's offense, because they got weapons, Artavis Scott and Mike Williams on the outside, Hunter Renfrow, of course. They got running back Wayne Gallman, and then, of course, Deshaun Watson. So it's going to be a tough task there for Auburn to deal with, but we're going to have to see what happens here in this matchup.
Auburn's been gutted at wide receiver, and they recruited just about as well as anybody at wide receiver in this past February's recruiting class. But are those true freshmen ready to play in this kind of game this early? It's doubtful. Marcus Davis is the one veteran coming back with 30 receptions from last year. And a late note here, and I think we're all ready for the offseason to be over, because the kids getting in trouble and getting hurt during summer camp and so forth is almost at an end. They seem to not get in trouble so much once we hit the season. But safety Stephen Roberts, a key player on special teams, one of the better ones for the Auburn Tigers, and also a key matchup guy against 4 and 5 wides, was arrested a day ago, possession of a gun without a permit. So it's Auburn, it's Clemson, 9 o'clock from the Plains on Saturday night. All right, a special Monday night game before the NFL takes over Monday night. Florida State coming off a 10-3 campaign. Ole Miss breaking into the elite of college football just in the last few seasons, winning a Sugar Bowl in a 10-win season for the Rebels, as well as they finished in the top 10, going at it in Orlando, Mike.
Yeah, and this, in my opinion, is the best football game of the weekend. There are a lot of big-time matchups highlighting the slate, but when you get to this game on Monday night, I mean, it's the last game of the weekend for a reason. I think when looking at Ole Miss and Florida State, Ole Miss has had all the offseason distractions, and that's something that has kind of been in the news. It's been swirling around, all the issues that they had post Laramie Tunsil there at the draft, and their recruiting investigation is going on now, and all the violations that may have taken place. It's an interesting situation at Ole Miss right now, but they have a quarterback in Chad Kelly who can take a game over. And in the SEC, you don't have many quarterbacks like that. Chad Kelly's one of the few, and he's a guy that I think is the de facto difference maker in this game, because when pitting him against a freshman quarterback in DeAndre Francois of Florida State, who, I mean, everybody's expecting him to be a pretty solid guy. I mean, Jimbo Fisher just this past week kind of alluded to some of the throws he's making in practice, saying they reminded him of a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback from a couple of years ago, Jameis Winston. So if DeAndre Francois comes out and plays as well as he's done in practice, which, it's an entirely different task when you're going up in week 1 against an SEC caliber defense, obviously, in Ole Miss. Those are two completely different things. But if DeAndre Francois plays well, I mean, I think that's the ultimate key to this football game. I think when looking at the rest of the roster, obviously Florida State's got Dalvin Cook, very good running back. I really think that he's a guy who can carry that offense at times, but let's face it, right now, I mean, if Ole Miss's defense is able to stop Dalvin Cook or at least slow him down and contain him just enough, and they're going to try to force DeAndre Francois to beat him with his arm, and whether or not he can do that is going to go a long way in determining who wins this football game.
Yeah, so you mentioned Chad Kelly. The situation with Chad Kelly is he carries this offense, 4,000 yards, 31 touchdowns, 10 rushing touchdowns. Ole Miss has almost made it to Atlanta in the SEC championship game, has actually defeated Alabama the past 2 years, almost getting to Atlanta. And probably the reason they didn't is the lack of a solid, strong running game from the running backs. Kelly takes on too much punishment himself in running the football. Jordan Wilkins, their top returning rusher, ineligible as of about 2 weeks ago when he was not enrolled in classes early enough. So they didn't meet the deadline. He's ineligible for this year. Akeem Judd comes back. He's got experience from last year, and Ole Miss fans are really intrigued by Eric Swinney. He's a redshirt freshman out of Atlanta. He was injured last year, but he's a 4-star recruit who can make big plays. He's got that kind of ability, even at this level, and they're interested in seeing him. That Florida State front seven is always exceptional, always one of the better units in college football, and I'm interested to see the effectiveness of Tunsil's replacement. So Ole Miss going back to the well of the top recruit at left tackle in all of high school football, coming into the collegiate ranks, in Greg Little. But is he ready as a true freshman starting against that Florida State front four on a Monday night with the eyes of the nation watching him as a left tackle. Boy, and Ole Miss starting 4 new offensive linemen. Chad Kelly is a great quarterback. I don't know if he can handle all of that. Demoria Stringfellow with Laquan Treadwell moving on to the Minnesota Vikings, the #1 receiving threat at wideout for Ole Miss. Evan Ingram, he's now a senior at Ole Miss, one of the very best tight ends, receiving tight ends in college football, has to have a big night for Ole Miss to score some points against this Florida State defense.
Yeah, I mean, with Florida State, and like you just spoke to a little bit there, Florida State's front four, they got Josh Sweat there. He's a guy coming into his sophomore year, was one of the more highly recruited defensive ends in the entire country. But from my neck of the woods in Virginia, he was one of the top players in the state when he graduated high school 2 years ago. The guy kind of got his feet wet last year, but he's really going to step into more of a full-time role, defensive end this year. And that matchup you just alluded to there with the offensive line and of course, Josh Sweat, who's going to swap around and kind of play both sides of the line there. Sweat can put a lot of pressure on you. He's a guy that's very good against the run, but he's even more lethal against the pass. I think he's going to be unleashed a little bit more this year than he had last year when he was a freshman. Florida State's front four is really good. The back end of their secondary, obviously, Derwin James leads the way. They got Trey Marshall, of course, as well. It's a very good unit, Florida State's defense is, and it was young last year, but I think it's a unit that's ready to make the next step. And Florida State's defense is really going to have to be as good as advertised if they want to, compete for a college football playoff spot and potentially win the Atlantic Division with that huge matchup against Clemson there in October. It's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see how Florida State copes with this huge matchup here right off the bat against Ole Miss. But like you alluded to before, I think Florida State's defense, they can put a lot of pressure on you, especially in the front seven there. If they're able to do that against an inexperienced offensive line there with Ole Miss, I think Florida State will be in good shape. But if they have trouble getting pressure on Chad Kelly, I mean, he's a guy that can take the game over. And I think he'll have Ole Miss right in until the end if he's able to sit back there and throw the ball comfortably all night.
So I guess the Rebels are going to load up against the run against Dalvin Cook and force Florida State to throw the ball downfield. Defensive tackle Isaac Gross, he missed all of 2015, but he was one of the better players at his position for Ole Miss in 2014. So he's back this season. Junior defensive end Marquise Haynes, coming off a 10-sack season for Ole Miss, obviously brings the heat off the edge. Interesting situation at linebacker for Ole Miss, and we're talking about a defense that has been in the top 10. I don't know what the statistics say, but they have been a top 10 defense in the nation the last 2 years. But at linebacker, they've been very thin, and they even lost what they had there. And one of the kids was Denzel Kimdichie, actually Robert Kimdichie's brother, who was their leader on defense at linebacker. So they bring in a transfer from Oregon State, Ramel Maggio, who had 87 tackles to lead Oregon State. Also a huge JUCO star in Dietrich Bing-Jukes coming in as well. DeMarcus Gates was their leading tackler, and he's back at outside linebacker with 76 tackles. Tony Connor, folks, he's a guy to look out for. He could have been a first-round selection in the 2014 draft. He decided to come back, really injury-plagued in 15, and so he got a red shirt and is playing here in 2016 for Ole Miss, suiting up in Game 1 against Florida State. And what, Mike, I got to agree with you. A lot of hype surrounds Alabama, USC, and some of the other matchups. But for me, if I could only watch one game, I'm very intrigued to see Florida State and Ole Miss matchup on Monday night.
Yeah, a lot of good games this weekend, but I think this Ole Miss-Florida State game probably takes the cake. I mean, they're putting this in prime time on Monday night for a reason, and hopefully it lives up to the hype that it's getting right now.
All right, it's the ACC against the SEC on opening weekend. Clemson-Auburn, North Carolina-Georgia, and this one we just wrapped up. The Seminoles taking on the Rebels in Orlando. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC helping us break it down. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you, Mark.